In the northern reaches, where the sun itself seemed a stranger, the forests lay draped in endless white. Snow fell in sheets that muffled sound, softening the edges of the world until silence became a living thing. It was a silence so absolute that even the wind, when it moved through skeletal branches, seemed to pause in reverence. Here, long before the first stories were written, long before firelight flickered in permanent dwellings, the land held a quiet terror, a terror not born of claws or fangs but of absence. Hunger, cold, and isolation were themselves monstrous, shaping minds as much as bodies. Men who wandered these forests spoke of shadows that moved just beyond the reach of the hearth. They spoke not with certainty, but with the tremor of experience, the kind of tremor that follows the unexplainable. In the long nights, when the pine boughs groaned under heavy frost, some claimed to see figures crouching in the snow, shapes that seemed too tall, too thin, too deliberate to belong to the known creatures of the land. Others said they heard breathing in the stillness that was not their own, ragged and hollow, a sound that pressed against the ribs like an invisible hand. And always there was the hunger, the gnawing, unending ache that transformed thought into obsession. In these frozen woods, hunger was not merely a lack of food. It was a shaping force. It carved men from the inside, hollowed their resolve, sharpened their instincts, and left them trembling on the edge of themselves. Those who knew the forest well learned to respect its quiet. Every snap of a branch, every distant rustle, was examined, measured, catalogued. Yet no amount of observation could account for the things that lived in the imagination of the starving mind. For when the body hungered, the mind began to hunger in tandem, consuming memory, morality, and self in equal measure. The earliest whispers of the Wendigo, though unnamed, took shape in these moments. They were not born from fantasy but from lived experience. Indigenous peoples of the northern forests, Algonquian-speaking communities, knew that the winter could make men monstrous. Long nights trapped in snowbound huts, the echo of empty stomachs, and the constant vigilance against predators of flesh and thought alike forged tales that were practical as well as terrifying. These stories were warnings, yes, but they were also mirrors. They reflected the unspoken truth that under certain pressures, any man might become something unrecognizable, something hungry, something insatiable. And yet, the fear was never only human. The forest itself seemed alive with intention. Pines swayed not with wind alone, but as if responding to the presence of those who dared traverse the frozen labyrinth. Mist rolled from frozen rivers in thin, ghost-like veils, curling around trees and rocks like the fingers of unseen sentinels. Snow glinted with a pale light that seemed to watch, and the eyes of creatures, wolves, lynx, and birds of prey, gleamed with a knowledge older than memory. In such a world, even the simplest act of walking through the forest became a negotiation with forces that were not fully comprehensible. Every step was a question, every sound a possible answer. The earliest humans in these forests developed a deep, instinctive understanding of absence and shadow. They knew that terror need not roar to exist, could whisper, could linger in peripheral vision. It could wait behind every frost-covered bough, patient and inevitable. And from these whispered fears grew the first language of the Wendigo. It was a language of restraint, of caution, of respect. The creature, if it could be called that, was less a being than a principle. The principle that the forest, the cold, and the hunger could claim more than bodies. They could claim the soul. Hunger, as chronicled in oral histories, was a slow teacher. It stretched days into an eternity of gnawing emptiness. Food, when it appeared, became treasure. Its absence became a crucible. Men who had once known generosity and community learned the cruel arithmetic of survival. If the body must endure, the heart and mind must be tested. And when those tests were too long, when the snow was relentless and the provisions had run dry, the line between man and monster began to blur. Those who returned from the forest spoke of unnameable shapes, and the shapes they described often bore the distorted echoes of their own desperation. The shadow of the Wendigo is, in essence, the shadow of humanity itself. It is hunger made manifest, isolation rendered visible. It is the reflection of fear so profound that it twists morality and reason. Anthropologists and folklorists have noted that the Wendigo represents a unique convergence. The physical reality of famine, the psychological reality of isolation, and the moral reality of transgression. In these northern forests, to break the taboos of survival was to invite the monster within, a monster whose gaze could strip a man of his humanity as surely as frostbite claimed his toes. Yet, as much as the Wendigo was feared, it was also understood. The Algonquian peoples wove rules into their daily lives, rituals into their survival, and stories into their conscience. These stories were more than entertainment. They were frameworks for maintaining balance. To speak of the Wendigo was to acknowledge the thin veneer of civilization and the ease with which it could crack. Every tale was a measure against excess, against greed, against the consumption of what one could not honor. For the Wendigo was never merely a creature of flesh. It was a lesson in the ethics of existence in a world where hunger was as inevitable as snow. Even now, centuries later, the whispers persist. In the vast, empty forests of Canada and the northern United States, the wind carries an echo of those first nights. The snow still bends under the weight of silence. And the shadow of hunger, though less immediate, lingers in the collective imagination, a reminder that terror need not be visible to be real. It is in the pause between breaths, the shiver that runs down the spine when the fire flickers, the sense of being watched by something older and wiser than humanity. In the frozen woods, the Wendigo waits, not as a monster of legend, but as a reflection of everything we fear in ourselves. The hunger that cannot be sated, the isolation that erodes reason, and the shadow that moves just beyond the reach of light. And in these whispers, these subtle stirrings beneath the snow, the forest reminds us that survival is never simple, and that even the human heart may harbor a monster it does not yet understand. Long before names, long before stories, long before firelight chased away the shadows, the winter woods held their secrets. And still, if one listens closely, the whispers remain. Quiet, patient, eternal. They are not merely the echoes of a people or a place, but of the hunger that has always lived inside us, waiting to speak. In the heart of the northern forests, where the wind sculpts the snow into ghostly forms and the sun barely rises above the horizon, hunger is not a simple absence of food. It is an intrusion, slow and insidious, into the very marrow of a man's being. The forests themselves seem to lean closer, listening, waiting, as the cold gnaws at flesh and spirit alike. Winter in these lands is a crucible, and those who enter it unprepared are reshaped, remade, in ways both physical and unseen. Famine, in these regions, was never merely the scarcity of sustenance. It was a force that transformed the living into something unrecognizable. Limbs grew thin, faces hollowed to shadows of bone, and the eyes, once clear and bright with the warmth of human life, darkened with the weight of relentless longing. Hunger crept through villages and hunting camps alike, and no prayer, no ritual, no charm could stave it entirely. Where men expected comfort or hope, they found only the gnawing emptiness of necessity, the realization that survival was a contest not just of strength, but of moral and mental endurance. Across the frozen expanses, entire communities could vanish into this slow dissolution. Anthropologists have noted that the peoples of the Algonquian forests developed intricate systems of resource sharing, careful stewardship of game, and rites of feasting precisely to ward off this internal erosion. Yet, even with such measures, the human body has limits. Muscle wastes, bones sharpen, and the mind begins to slip, seeking ways to justify acts that daylight and conscience would never otherwise permit. Cannibalism, whispered of in the darkest corners of memory, was not born from malevolence, but from the cruel arithmetic of survival. It was the ultimate surrender to hunger's transformative power, a mirror held to the deepest and most primal of human instincts. In the silence of these winters, when snow muffled footsteps and the forest seemed endless, the line between man and monster began to blur. The Wendigo, a specter of the Algonquian imagination, is not merely a tale to frighten children. It is a reflection, a projection, of what men become when the body demands more than the world can provide. Anthropologists and psychologists alike have described this creature as a symbol: elongated limbs, insatiable hunger, eyes that burn with the cold of the forest, but always a human mind trapped in an unnatural form. Here myth and experience converge. Where hunger dominates, the self becomes fragmented. Morality bends under the weight of appetite. The forest, ever patient, watches this transformation unfold with a quiet inevitability. Historical accounts from fur traders, missionaries, and early settlers speak of men wandering into the snowbound woods, their bodies thin and brittle, their eyes haunted by visions that may have been fever, despair, or something stranger still. They returned, or did not return, carrying with them stories of companions transformed, or of men who no longer resembled themselves, yet spoke in the same voice. The Algonquian people, inheritors of centuries of observation and caution, told their children of the Wendigo in part to encode this knowledge. Beware greed, beware isolation, beware hunger that demands more than it should. The myth was a guide, a warning carved in narrative, meant to protect not only the body, but the fragile structure of society itself. Physiologically, hunger is a sculptor both cruel and precise. When the body lacks sustenance, the brain begins to respond in ways that can be terrifying to those unprepared. Impulses override reason, sleep becomes fractured, and perception is colored by an urgent need that is both unmistakable and relentless. The Wendigo syndrome, a term coined in modern psychiatric literature, captures a disturbing phenomenon. Individuals, consumed by starvation and extreme isolation, experience an overwhelming desire to consume human flesh. Yet even here, in clinical observation, the underlying truth remains profoundly human. It is not evil but desperation. It is not fantasy, but the lived reality of bodies and minds pushed to their extremes. But beyond the anatomy of the body lies the anatomy of the spirit. Hunger is never merely physical. It twists thought, reshapes memory, and distorts the self. Men and women, once kind and rational, began to see shadows in the corners of their cabins, shapes beneath the trees, eyes that reflected their own growing emptiness. In these frozen hours, the imagination itself becomes a force, fed by fear, superstition, and the quiet terror of knowing the body may outstrip the morality that governs it. The Wendigo, in this sense, is as much a psychological truth as it is a folkloric invention, a creature born from the intersection of need and isolation, hunger and imagination, human frailty and the inexorable laws of nature. Consider, too, the moral dimension. Stories of cannibalism, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, were understood differently in these contexts. A man starving in the forest is not a criminal in the eyes of the universe. He is a subject of circumstance. The Wendigo legend embodies this tension, presenting a being that is both human and monstrously other. To become a Wendigo is not simply to take life, but to surrender the very essence of humanity to an appetite that can never be sated. It is a caution against letting desire dominate reason, a meditation on the delicate balance between survival and morality. And yet, there is an eerie beauty in this transformation. The northern forests, with their crystalline ice and whispering pines, create a landscape where life and death, body and spirit, hunger and fear, intermingle with a haunting clarity. To study the Wendigo is to study the human condition itself. How desperation shapes behavior, how isolation amplifies fear, and how survival can twist both body and soul. There is poetry in this horror, a rhythm to the terror, a cadence that echoes in every wind-lashed night and every shadow across the snow. By understanding hunger in its deepest form, we glimpse a truth often hidden beneath layers of folklore. Humans are fragile, not only in body but in mind. The Wendigo, in all its terrifying specificity, is a mirror to this fragility. It asks us to consider what we are capable of when the elements conspire against us, when the earth refuses to yield sustenance, when the cold settles deep into bone and spirit alike. It is a warning, but also a story of endurance, of the fine line between collapse and survival, of the power of imagination to shape the fears that guide us. In the end, the anatomy of hunger is not merely a physiological study, nor is it simply the subject of myth. It is a meditation on human limits, a testament to the terrifying elegance of survival, and a reflection of the spaces where morality, instinct, and imagination converge. In the stillness of the forest, where frost clings to the tips of evergreens and the moon casts silver upon endless snow, the Wendigo waits, not just in story, but in memory, in caution, in the quiet understanding that hunger is never just hunger. Transforms, reshapes, and it lingers long after the last ember of the fire has died, in the shadowed places of the mind where men first learned that survival comes at a cost far greater than the body alone. In the farthest reaches of the northern forests, where the sun itself seems hesitant to linger, silence reigns with a weight almost physical. Snow drifts over frozen rivers and dense pine, burying the land beneath an unbroken white that stretches to horizons unseen. In this world, time moves differently. The hours bleed into one another, muted by the frost-laden air, and the wind whispers through the trees like a living memory. To dwell here is to confront the vastness of absence, not merely the absence of warmth or of food, but of human presence itself. It is a solitude that penetrates deeper than the coldest night, gnawing at the soul in a way that hunger alone could never accomplish. Men and women who entered these northern reaches were often bound by necessity rather than choice. Hunters following caribou, trappers setting their lines, and isolated villages clinging to the edges of habitations all lived in the shadow of a profound emptiness. At first, the isolation was a companionable quiet, a chance to measure one's own thoughts against the rhythm of the land. But as days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, the absence of human contact began to warp perception. Eyes, accustomed only to the monochrome of snow and sky, would perceive movement in the branches where none existed. Whispers would be heard in the hush of the woods, voices carried on the wind, and shapes, at once familiar and grotesque, would flicker at the corner of the mind. It was in this crucible of loneliness that the seeds of myth were sown. Stories arose not merely to entertain, but to explain, to give form to the unseen and unknowable. In Algonquian traditions, the Wendigo was said to dwell in precisely these frozen expanses. It was a creature born of human fear, yes, but also of human frailty. Hunger could strip a man of reason, starvation of restraint. Isolation stripped him further, until the boundaries between thought, desire, and reality blurred into something darker, something monstrous. In these lands, the imagination was not a refuge, but a predator, and those who lingered too long alone were said to risk awakening it within themselves. Anthropologists and historians have long noted that the extremes of environment shape not only the body but the mind. In the north, where winter dominates the calendar and daylight itself is scarce, humans endured a psychological weight alongside the physical. Loneliness became a tangible presence, pressing upon hearts and bones with the same relentless force as the cold. In communities that survived here for generations, ritual and story were as essential as firewood or preserved meat. Tales of wandering spirits, of creatures that devoured both flesh and sanity, were more than allegory. They were warnings. They were mirrors reflecting the precariousness of life, the fragile tether between civilization and the wilderness, between order and chaos. There is a particular kind of terror in realizing that the mind can turn against itself. For those who spent long winters alone in the forests, isolation was not simply a condition but a transformation. The human spirit, deprived of companionship, conversation, and confirmation of shared reality, began to imagine the impossible. Eyes, scanning the endless white, would mistake a shadow for a figure. The whisper of the wind through skeletal branches became the echo of some distant, ravenous being. Hunger and solitude entwined, crafting a specter that was at once external and internal. The Wendigo was not merely a story told around the fire. It was the crystallization of human despair, a reflection of what man could become when stripped of community, morality, and hope. Accounts from early settlers and explorers describe this effect with chilling clarity. Men and women, driven into the forests by necessity or curiosity, returned with stories that seemed half dream, half memory. They spoke of faces in the snow, elongated limbs that moved impossibly, and a hunger that was more than physical, a gnawing, insatiable craving that consumed the spirit long before it touched the flesh. Many scholars now suggest that these accounts, once dismissed as fanciful, reveal a profound truth about human cognition under extreme isolation. The mind, bereft of social anchors, seeks meaning in narrative even where none exists. The Wendigo, in this sense, was as much a psychological entity as it was a folkloric one. Yet the terror it inspired was not abstract. To believe in the Wendigo was to respect the limits imposed by the forest, the winter, and the human heart. Communities developed protocols, rituals, and taboos, not only to protect themselves from starvation or predation, but to guard against the moral decay that isolation could foster. The tales of men transformed into monsters, of once respected hunters succumbing to cannibalistic frenzy, served as cautionary mirrors. They reminded the living that the wilderness was more than a landscape. It was a crucible that could dissolve identity, ethics, and reason alike. Even today, the lessons of this isolation resonate. The forests of the north, though more accessible and less threatening than in centuries past, retain a haunting presence. Travelers report the same sense of quiet oppression, the same intangible weight pressing upon the psyche. Modern psychology recognizes these effects in conditions as varied as cabin fever, extreme solitude, and sensory deprivation. The Wendigo persists not only in stories or in cinema, but as a metaphor for the consequences of disconnection, from society, from empathy, and from the shared reality that binds human experience. In the end, the isolation of the North is both literal and symbolic. It is the space where hunger and cold confront man with his own vulnerability, where the mind conjures shadows to fill the void of absence. It is a reminder that even in the absence of monsters, human fear can manufacture them, that even in the absence of darkness, the human spirit can see it everywhere. The Wendigo, born of snow and silence, hunger and loneliness, endures as a testament to the perilous fragility of solitude. And so the forests remain. Endless pines sway under the weight of winter, rivers lie frozen beneath ice that conceals what may have walked upon it, and the wind carries voices that no one can name. Those who enter these lands alone, even now, confront the same truths as their ancestors, that the greatest terrors are often reflections of ourselves, shaped by isolation, sharpened by hunger, and made real by the imagination that survival demands. The North does not simply test the body. It tests the soul, leaving behind echoes in the snow, whispers of what hunger, loneliness, and fear can awaken when left unchecked. And in the quiet, beneath the drifting flakes and the shadow of the pines, one can still feel it, a presence not entirely imagined, yet not entirely seen. It waits, patient and eternal, in the spaces where the human heart meets the wilderness, reminding us that isolation is more than absence. It is a crucible, a mirror, and sometimes a doorway to the monstrous within. In the frozen reaches of the northern forests, where the wind cuts through the pines like a sharpened blade, there exists a word that has traveled through centuries, whispered with the weight of fear and reverence. Wendigo. A syllable that lingers on the lips of those who know its stories, carrying with it a history older than any written account. It is a name shaped by the Algonquian peoples, forged in the cold crucible of winter, starvation, and solitude, a word that embodies more than mere terror, yet never less. To speak it is to remember the land itself, endless snowfields, dense forests, and rivers that shatter beneath the ice. These were lands that demanded vigilance, that punished neglect with slow, gnawing hunger. In such places, survival was a fragile thread, and every tale carried a lesson, a map of danger etched in cautionary words. The Wendigo was first and foremost a story of that danger, a spirit that embodied hunger so consuming it could erode the boundaries of morality, of humanity itself. Yet the name is layered, complex, and often misunderstood. In Algonquian languages, the term does not simply describe a creature. It conveys a condition of the soul, a moral warning that hunger, greed, or selfishness can transform the human heart into something alien and monstrous. It is a reflection, both literal and figurative, of the worst excesses of need, the insatiable appetites that dwell not only in the belly but in the mind. The Wendigo, in its earliest conception, was as much an allegory as it was a specter. It was the embodiment of fear made flesh, and yet it was inseparable from the human condition it sought to illuminate. Historical accounts, collected from early European settlers and native storytellers alike, describe the Wendigo in ambiguous terms. Some speak of a towering, emaciated figure, with skin pulled tight over the bones, eyes that glimmer with unending hunger. Others tell of men who, lost to isolation and famine, became something inhuman, their bodies and spirits consumed by the very need that should have preserved them. But these descriptions, vivid as they are, only hint at the deeper truth. The Wendigo was never only a monster. It was a warning encoded in story, a mirror held up to the frailty of humanity in a world that demands both cooperation and endurance to survive. The etymology of the name itself carries this weight. Wendigo, or Wendigo in some dialects, is believed to derive from Algonquian roots that signify greed, gluttony, or insatiable desire. It is a word that is careful, deliberate, and resonant, chosen to linger in memory. Its pronunciation carries a subtle cadence, a rising and falling that mirrors the rhythms of the forest wind and the relentless hunger it represents. To say it aloud is to evoke the cold forests, the long nights, the gnawing fear that even the strongest men might succumb to the void within themselves. Across generations, the name traveled with stories of caution and tragedy. Elders spoke of it beside the fire, warning children not only against wandering into the forest unprepared but against allowing selfishness or despair to grow unchecked in the heart. These tales were not mere superstition, they were survival tools, moral compasses disguised as folklore. The Wendigo reminded a people intimately familiar with scarcity that hunger was not only a matter of food, but of spirit, that in taking more than one needed, in yielding to greed, one risked losing the very essence of one's humanity. Psychologists and anthropologists, looking back through the lens of modern thought, have suggested that the Wendigo myth also encodes a deep awareness of the mind's fragility under extreme conditions. The cold and isolation of the northern winters, combined with starvation and fear, can drive a person to acts that would have been unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. Cannibalism, long the most dreaded of taboos, becomes both a literal and symbolic motif in these stories, illustrating the transformation from man to Wendigo. The very name carries this duality. It is both the whisper of a spirit and the echo of human desperation, a reminder that monsters are born not only in the forest but in the hearts of men when all else fails. And yet, for all its darkness, the Wendigo is not a tale of hopelessness. Within its name lies a form of reverence, a recognition of the delicate balance between humanity and the wilderness that sustains and threatens it. To name it is to acknowledge both fear and respect. The Wendigo is a reflection of human fragility, yes, but it is also a testament to the communities that survive despite the hunger, the cold, and the shadow of their own potential for corruption. Through story, the Algonquian peoples wove a network of memory and caution, ensuring that the lessons encoded in that single word, Wendigo, would endure across centuries, whispered on winter winds, carried in song and ritual, and eventually recorded for the world to ponder. In its migration from oral tradition to the written accounts of settlers, from folkloric caution to modern psychological study, the Wendigo has retained the core of its power. A name that speaks simultaneously of spirit and sin, of nature and human frailty, of the thin line between survival and surrender. It is a syllable that resonates because it is rooted in the deepest human fears, yet it survives because it also embodies wisdom, the recognition that what haunts us most is not always an external force, but the capacity within ourselves to yield to that which would undo us. The Wendigo endures because its name is not merely a label. It is a vessel of memory, a vessel of warning, and a vessel of awe. To utter it is to call forth the ancient forests, the silent snowfields, the endless hunger of men and the spirits that echo their struggles. It is to remember that stories are not frivolous. They are the architecture of culture, the scaffolding upon which human understanding rests. Through this single word, generations have transmitted the weight of experience, the lessons of restraint and morality, and the knowledge that isolation and hunger can birth more than desperation. They can birth monsters if not checked by conscience, community, and care. And so, Wendigo remains, a whispered syllable in the northern wind, carrying the shadows of centuries, the echoes of famine, and the eternal caution of human frailty. It is a name that is never simple, for it is never merely a story. It is a reflection of ourselves, our hunger, our isolation, our capacity for transformation, and, ultimately, our need to remember who we are lest we become what we most fear. In the silent, frozen forests, it still waits, not only as legend, but as reminder. To speak its name is to feel the frost, to sense the hunger, and to confront the shadow within. In the endless forests of the north, where snow lay in unbroken silence for months and the wind carried whispers of the unseen, human communities learned that survival was never merely a matter of food or shelter. It was a delicate balance between the body and the soul, between the flesh that hungered and the spirit that sought to endure. In these frozen lands, hunger was more than a pang or a longing. It was a shadow that crept slowly into the heart, bending the mind toward despair, twisting bonds of kinship into suspicion and fear. It was here, amid the ever-pressing cold, that the Wendigo became more than a story. It became a moral compass, a warning woven into ritual and remembrance. For the peoples of the Algonquian-speaking regions, the Wendigo was not merely a creature of myth, but a specter that mirrored the fragility of human restraint. Its hunger was infinite, insatiable, a reflection of what could happen when the basic laws of survival overwhelmed the laws of the heart. Cannibalism, though rare, was not unheard of in the harsh winters where snowbound villages could be cut off from the world for months at a time. And yet, even in such extremity, these communities recognized that giving in to such urges carried consequences beyond the immediate act. The Wendigo was born, they believed, not from an external beast but from the corruption of the human soul. To consume another human was to invite into oneself a spirit that could never be satiated, that could transform a man into a hollow echo of greed and malice. It was within this context of hunger and danger that ritual emerged, not as superstition, but as a careful, deliberate means of preserving both society and morality. Story and ceremony became shields against the slow erosion of human decency. Through rites of purification, offerings, and communal observance, the people carved order from the chaos of winter, establishing boundaries between what must be done to survive and what must never be done, even when survival itself trembled on a knife's edge. Some ceremonies invoked the presence of spirits who could guide or restrain. Others were enacted to expel the restless hunger that threatened to devour the soul from within. In these rituals, the community spoke in the language of both fear and reverence, acknowledging the fragile dance between necessity and transgression. The act of ritual was never passive. It demanded participation, attention, and an acceptance of the weight of consequence. Elders recited the tales of those who had succumbed, of men and women transformed by greed or desperation into shadows of themselves. Children learned the signs of hunger unchecked by mercy, the posture of the Wendigo's spirit within the mind. Through repetition and observation, every member of the village internalized a subtle moral architecture. The community itself became a safeguard, a living containment of the darkness that winter could awaken. In this way, fear was not merely a tool of oppression or entertainment. It was a lens through which the fragile human condition could be seen, examined, and ultimately restrained. These rituals were often stark and solemn, carried out beside the crackling fires that were themselves a fragile barrier against the consuming cold. Offerings might include the smallest portion of meat or the first fruits of a meager harvest, acts of acknowledgement that survival was never owed, that life could be both fragile and sacred. Some rites involved cleansing with smoke or the repetition of chants, each syllable a thread in a tapestry meant to contain the insatiable hunger both literal and symbolic. Through these acts, the Wendigo's presence was named, confronted, and kept at a distance, not as a myth of fear alone, but as a profound articulation of human limits and ethical boundaries. Yet beneath the measured cadence of ritual lay an undercurrent of unease. To perform a rite was to admit the proximity of chaos, to recognize that human desire and necessity could erupt into monstrosity. The Wendigo, in this sense, was never far from the human hearth. It lurked in the mind's quiet corners, in the restless nights when the snowstorm trapped a hunter far from home. It waited in the gnawing absence of food, in the frayed nerves of those whose kinship and compassion were tested beyond measure. Ritual, then, was as much about vigilance as it was about devotion. Each gesture, each chant, each story was a tether to humanity, a fragile bond against the consuming spirit of hunger made flesh. Anthropologically, these practices illuminate something profound about the human response to extremity. The Wendigo is, in essence, a reflection of the tension between instinct and morality. Communities that acknowledged this tension created spaces in which it could be confronted, ritualized, and contained. Where food scarcity threatened to unmoor ethical norms, ceremony offered a framework for restraint, a reminder that survival could never justify the obliteration of one's humanity. The stories served a dual purpose. To frighten, yes, but also to instruct, to reinforce a cultural understanding of limits, and to protect both the living and the living's collective conscience. Even today, these rites, though often unremembered in their original form, echo in stories, cautionary tales, and the continued fascination with the Wendigo. They remind us that myth is rarely mere fiction. It is memory, encoded in metaphor, reflecting both the outer world and the inner human landscape. The ritualized fear of the Wendigo is, at its core, a meditation on restraint, on the ethical architecture required to survive not only the winter but the darker impulses that winter could awaken. It is a testament to human ingenuity, a recognition that even in the face of unrelenting deprivation, culture and conscience could endure. And so, when the stories speak of the Wendigo prowling the snowy forests, they are not speaking only of a spirit of greed or of cannibalism. They are speaking of us. Of hunger that gnaws beyond the body, of fear that whispers in the quiet of the night, of the moral compromises that survival can tempt and the ceremonies that resist them. Each ritual, each story, each whispered warning is a tether cast into the wilderness of human desire, a line connecting the present to the past, the mortal to the immortal, the flesh to the spirit. In the coldest nights, when the wind howls across frozen lakes and the trees groan under the weight of ice, one can still hear, if only faintly, the cadence of those ancient rites. Smoke curls from long-extinguished fires. Words once spoken to contain hunger linger in the air, carrying a caution that is as vital now as it was centuries ago. That survival without restraint is no victory, that to live without conscience is to invite the Wendigo within. In the end, the ceremonies of the North are not merely relics of superstition. They are testament. They are proof that even when winter stretches into eternity, even when hunger gnaws at the edges of civilization, the human spirit can carve boundaries against the darkness. And as the stories fade into snow and shadow, they leave behind a quiet, enduring truth, that the Wendigo was never just a monster of the forest. It was the reflection of our own hunger, and the rituals were the fragile hope that humanity could endure it. In the deep forests of the northern wilds, where the wind carries the scent of pine and frost, the true horror of the Wendigo was not what lurked outside, but what could awaken within. It was not merely a creature stalking the snowbound paths, but a reflection of human fragility, a mirror held to the mind when hunger, isolation, and desperation converged. To speak of the Wendigo was, in these lands, to speak of the very boundaries of the human soul, of what happens when the thin veneer of civilization slips beneath the weight of survival. The stories of the Algonquian peoples were never merely cautionary tales of an external monster. They were warnings of transformation, of men who, driven by the unbearable pangs of famine, turned upon one another. In these legends, the Wendigo was not born from the forests or the cold, but from the collapse of restraint, from the surrender of morality when the body demanded more than the conscience could bear. A man who ate his kin, even in desperation, was said to be claimed by the Wendigo. His flesh becoming gaunt, his eyes hollow, his heart consumed by a hunger that no amount of food could sate. Anthropologists and historians who have studied these accounts note a remarkable consistency. The Wendigo is always described in human terms first. It begins with thoughts, desires, impulses, and a subtle decay of empathy. There is the first tremor of self-interest unchecked by social bonds, the whisper of appetite that ignores the sacredness of life. Slowly, inexorably, the man becomes less than man. Limbs elongate in the imagination of witnesses, skin tightens over bones like parchment, and an insatiable craving rises from the marrow itself. This is not just a tale of physical transformation. It is a narrative of the mind consumed, of the soul surrendered to necessity, of the monster that lives within every human when moral boundaries erode. The Wendigo, then, is a mirror. It asks a question as old as hunger itself. What is a man without restraint? In the snowbound villages where survival teetered on the edge of human endurance, tales of neighbors transformed into monsters were more than entertainment. They were lessons in psychology, in social cohesion, in the preservation of empathy against the relentless logic of survival. The forest, indifferent and infinite, became a stage on which these human dramas played out, where the primal instincts of self-preservation collided with the delicate architecture of community. There are accounts of men wandering alone, lost to the endless white, who returned changed, or never returned at all. Some were rumored to have been driven mad by hunger, their thoughts invaded by whispers they did not understand, their desires shifting toward acts they would never have imagined in the warmth of hearth or home. The Wendigo, in these instances, is not a supernatural creature but a psychosis made manifest, a tangible expression of the internal chaos that starvation and isolation could provoke. Anthropologists have compared these phenomena to documented cases of Wendigo psychosis, in which individuals develop an obsessive fear of becoming a cannibal or a compulsion to consume human flesh. In this way, the myth is inseparable from the human mind. The monster exists as both metaphor and reality, a warning and a manifestation. Yet, the horror of the Wendigo is not only its appetite, but the slow erasure of humanity. When a man succumbs, he does not simply kill or consume. He loses the capacity for love, for empathy, for the understanding that binds communities together. Families are destroyed from within. Villages remember the names of those who vanished into the monster, recounting in hushed tones the stories of individuals whose hunger became unbounded, whose moral compass dissolved under the unyielding pressure of survival. In these narratives, the Wendigo is both predator and reflection, a lens through which the human capacity for destruction can be observed, a dark mirror revealing what we might become when our most sacred restraints are shattered. The imagery associated with the Wendigo is haunting in its simplicity and symbolism. Witnesses speak of gaunt figures, their ribs visible beneath taut skin, eyes sunken yet gleaming with a feral light, mouths stretched in hunger that no sustenance can satisfy. Limbs are exaggerated, movements unnatural, as if the very shape of the human body bends to accommodate the insatiable desire within. These descriptions are more than folklore. They encode the psychological terror of losing oneself, of recognizing in another, or oneself, the potential for inhumanity. The monster within is as much a cautionary illustration of moral collapse as it is a warning against cannibalism. There is also a spiritual dimension to this transformation. Among the Algonquian peoples, the Wendigo was considered a spirit that could possess a man, particularly one whose soul was weakened by greed, selfishness, or despair. Rituals and stories were designed to contain this force, to warn that the line between human and monster was thin, and that it could be crossed not only by acts of consumption, but by the corrosive erosion of ethical conduct. To acknowledge the Wendigo was to acknowledge that hunger and isolation could corrode the very essence of humanity, and that the community itself bore the responsibility to guide and restrain those at risk. This duality, the Wendigo as both internal and external threat, creates a profound resonance that persists today. Modern psychology interprets it as a psychosis, a culturally specific syndrome born of extreme environmental pressures, while anthropologists see in it a complex moral and social system designed to preserve cohesion. Yet, beyond scientific explanation, the story endures as a meditation on human nature. It reminds us that monstrosity is rarely something entirely alien, that the darkest forces often arise from within, and that the preservation of conscience is a daily, sometimes desperate, struggle. And so, when we hear the stories of men transformed by hunger, of villages haunted by absent neighbors, of forests that whisper of unseen eyes, we are not merely listening to myth. We are glimpsing the fragile architecture of humanity, the thin veil between civilization and the wilderness of desire. The Wendigo is not simply a creature of cold and snow. It is the echo of our own potential for destruction, a mirror held to the heart of human desperation. In the quiet of winter, when the wind sweeps over the frozen lakes and through the skeletal trees, it is possible to imagine the faint stirrings of that internal hunger, the shadow of that transformation. The monster within is always patient, always present, waiting for the moment when hunger, fear, and isolation converge. And yet, the stories of old, passed from parent to child, serve as a tether, a fragile, enduring boundary reminding us that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit can resist, that conscience and compassion are the truest defenses against the wilderness not just of the forest, but of the self. In the end, the Wendigo is never simply outside us. It walks alongside, within the mind, in the slow erosion of morality, in the quiet whisper of desire made monstrous. To know it is to recognize the precariousness of humanity, to honor the delicate balance that keeps the soul intact amid hunger, fear, and the cold that presses upon every human heart. And in that recognition we find both terror and truth, that the most dangerous monsters are those that already live inside us, and the only rights that endure. In the northern wilderness, where the pines groan under the weight of frost and the rivers lie buried beneath sheets of ice, the Wendigo is said to inhabit more than the bodies of men. It inhabits their very essence. The horror is not simply in the stretching of limbs or the hollowing of cheeks, but in the profound intertwining of flesh and spirit. It is here, in the liminal space between survival and surrender, that the monster becomes a mirror of human nature, revealing the deep fractures that hunger and despair can carve into the soul. Those who tell the oldest stories speak of figures whose physical forms betrayed the gnawing hunger within. The skin, stretched tight over sharp bones, was pale and gray, lips cracked and lips stained dark from the constant craving of unrelenting appetite. Eyes glimmered with a light that was neither wholly human nor entirely animal, reflecting the emptiness and fire of a desire that could never be satisfied. Yet, as striking as these images are, they are only the surface of the Wendigo's true terror. Beneath the flesh lies a spirit transformed, a mind consumed, a heart hollowed, a soul that has surrendered to the ceaseless pull of craving. The Algonquian peoples understood this duality intimately. To them, the Wendigo was more than a cautionary tale. It was a lesson in vigilance, a study in the inseparability of physical and spiritual corruption. When a man gave in to acts of desperation, cannibalism, greed, or selfishness, he was not merely breaking a social taboo. He was allowing the spirit of the Wendigo to enter, and in doing so, he became a vessel for its insatiable hunger. It was not simply an external force, but an internal transformation, one that reshaped the body to reflect the corruption of the heart and mind. Anthropologists have noted that such narratives serve a strikingly human purpose. In extreme environments where famine and isolation could erode social cohesion, the Wendigo myth functioned as a moral compass. It externalized internal danger, giving form to impulses that might otherwise remain abstract and unexamined. The descriptions of elongated limbs, skeletal frames, and gaunt faces were symbolic extensions of a deeper fear. The collapse of ethical restraint, the dissolution of the self into primal appetite. In this sense, flesh and spirit were inseparable, intertwined in the telling of each cautionary tale. There are accounts, passed down through generations, of men who wandered alone into the forests, who returned altered or not at all. Those who survived spoke of a feeling that was impossible to describe, a gnawing at the center of the soul, an emptiness that could not be sated by food, warmth, or human companionship. It was as though their bodies had become vessels for something larger than themselves, a hunger that reached beyond the physical to consume the mind. And in these tales, the Wendigo was always present, not as a separate entity, but as an echo of the self, a reflection of what could happen when desire eclipses morality. Spiritually, the Wendigo embodies the tension between human necessity and ethical restraint. Rituals and ceremonies attempted to reconcile these forces, to anchor the body and mind to communal values even in the face of dire scarcity. Offerings of food, chants, and purification rites were designed to appease the spirit and prevent the transformation from taking hold. These acts were more than superstition. They were profound acknowledgments of human fragility, of the way that flesh and spirit are bound, and of the need to cultivate vigilance against impulses that might unmake a person from the inside out. Modern interpretations echo this duality. Psychologists studying Wendigo psychosis describe a compulsive fear of consuming human flesh and an obsessive hunger that seems beyond conscious control. In these cases, the boundary between flesh and spirit collapses, the body's cravings and the mind's moral panic intertwine, creating a cycle of obsession and terror. The myth, therefore, was not only an external warning, but a sophisticated recognition of the internal dangers posed by extreme conditions, isolation and starvation. The metaphor of the Wendigo endures because it speaks to something universal: the fragile equilibrium between desire and morality, body and conscience, survival and ethics. In these tales, the monster is not simply a terror to be avoided. It is an intimate reflection of human weakness, a vivid illustration of how closely the self can be tied to forces beyond reason. Hunger, when left unchecked, transforms more than the body. It transforms the mind and the spirit, erasing the boundaries that define us as human. Even today, the imagery persists. Gaunt, elongated forms moving through snow, eyes flickering with hunger beyond sustenance, hands clawing for that which should never be taken. It is a haunting symbol, not of some external threat, but of the internal struggle every human faces when survival presses against conscience. Flesh and spirit entwined, the Wendigo is the embodiment of that struggle, a monster created not only by the cold and snow, but by the capacity for human desire to devour itself when untamed. And so, as the wind whispers through the skeletal trees and the snow crunches beneath unseen feet, the story of the Wendigo reminds us that horror is rarely only outside ourselves. The deepest terror lies within, the hunger that gnaws at our conscience, the impulses that threaten to unravel the bonds of morality, the desire that reshapes body and spirit alike. In acknowledging this, the myths endure, tethering us to the lessons of survival and restraint, whispering across the centuries that the monster is never far, and often resides within the very heart we call our own. In the end, the Wendigo is as much a reflection as it is a warning, a creature of flesh shaped by spirit, a spirit shaped by flesh, and a reminder that human vulnerability, when confronted with hunger and isolation, is as profound as it is terrifying. The forest may lie silent, the snow may fall without witness, but within the human heart, the Wendigo waits, patient, eternal, entwined with every longing that stretches beyond the limits of the self. Winter in the northern forests is not merely cold. It is a force that shapes the mind, the body, and the stories we tell. Snow blankets the world in silence, rivers freeze into unbroken sheets of ice, and the wind cuts through the trees with a voice that seems older than memory itself. In these lands, survival is never assured. The cold is not simply an absence of warmth, it is a test of endurance, a crucible in which the boundaries of human morality and spirit are laid bare. And it is within this frozen expanse that the Wendigo thrives, not merely as a creature of legend, but as a reflection of the relentless pressures that can transform man into monster. For communities isolated by miles of forest and months of unyielding winter, the cold was an omnipresent adversary. Food became scarce, travel nearly impossible, and human connection a precious, fragile commodity. In such extremes, the mind begins to wander into dark territories, imagining shapes in the drifting snow and hearing voices in the howling wind. The Wendigo, with its insatiable hunger and skeletal form, became a personification of these fears. It was a spirit born not only of moral collapse but of the unrelenting weight of cold, hunger, and isolation, a monstrous embodiment of the harsh environment itself. Survival in these conditions demanded more than skill or knowledge. It required the preservation of human restraint. The cold, unyielding, and indifferent forced communities to confront the limits of endurance. One misstep, one lapse in judgment could lead to starvation, and with starvation came temptation, the gnawing impulse to consume that which should never be eaten. Here, the Wendigo was not only a cautionary figure in folklore, it was a reflection of a real and terrifying possibility, a warning encoded into story, ritual, and law. Historical accounts describe villages where the long winters pressed life to its breaking point. Families rationed food with extreme care. Travelers buried under snow were often left for days in the wilderness, and entire communities sometimes faced weeks without fresh sustenance. In such moments, the thin veneer of civilization could begin to crack. Hunger gnawed at the mind as much as it did at the body, and the ethical boundaries that normally guided human behavior became dangerously malleable. It was in these crucibles that tales of the Wendigo gained their most chilling resonance. Men and women who might otherwise have acted with compassion and foresight were said to have been consumed by a deeper hunger, one that reshaped body, mind, and spirit alike. The cold also played a spiritual role in shaping the legend. In Algonquian belief, the Wendigo was often linked to extreme conditions, its appearance a sign of both environmental and moral peril. The frozen landscape, with its barren trees and endless white horizons, became a symbolic mirror of the emptiness that unchecked desire could create in the human heart. To see the Wendigo was to confront the ultimate test of morality in extremity, Could a person maintain restraint when every instinct demanded violation? Could compassion survive the unrelenting demands of survival? The cold made these questions tangible, and the stories passed down through generations carried their answers. Anthropologists and folklorists have noted that harsh environments often give rise to myths that embody both practical and ethical lessons. The Wendigo is exemplary in this regard. It represents the literal and figurative hunger that winter imposes, and the spiritual consequences of surrendering to it. The icy forests functioned as both setting and teacher, shaping narratives in which morality, fear, and survival were inseparably intertwined. In this way, the Wendigo was never merely a monster of flesh. It was a cautionary force, a spiritual gauge against the erosion of ethical and social norms in the face of extreme adversity. Even the physical imagery of the Wendigo reflects this intimate connection to winter's cruelty. Its elongated limbs, hollow eyes, and skeletal frame echo the starkness of the landscape, the bareness of trees stripped by snow, and the way the cold leeches life from all it touches. Witnesses describe it moving silently across frozen lakes, its footsteps absorbed by the wind, a figure as ghostly and relentless as the winter itself. It is a reminder that the environment is as much a participant in human fate as any external adversary, shaping not only stories but the very behavior and consciousness of those who live within it. The psychological weight of the cold cannot be overstated. Isolation, hunger, and relentless frost erode the mind in ways that are subtle, then profound. People become more prone to hallucination, to imagining shapes and shadows where none exist, and to perceiving danger in the absence of immediate threat. The Wendigo, in this context, is not just a story to frighten children. It is a narrative response to the fragility of perception under extreme duress. It embodies the delicate interplay between environmental stress and human morality, illustrating how survival pressures can give rise to both fear and folklore. And yet, despite the terror and the hunger, communities endured. Rituals, taboos, and shared stories served as anchors, tethering individuals to collective conscience and cultural memory. The cold, while relentless, could not entirely extinguish humanity, for even in the most inhospitable winters, the stories of the Wendigo reminded people of limits, of restraint, of the spiritual and moral structures that must be maintained if one is to survive not only physically, but ethically. In the quiet of the frozen forest, where the wind whispers through skeletal pines and snow falls without sound, the Wendigo remains a shadow both literal and figurative. It is the hunger that gnaws beneath the surface, the darkness that grows in isolation, the monster that embodies winter's relentless tests. The cold as a grave is not merely the absence of warmth, it is a trial of body and soul, a mirror of the fragility and resilience of humanity. And so, as we trace the footprints of those who lived and feared in these frozen landscapes, we recognize that the Wendigo is inseparable from the cold. It is inextricable from the winter's silence, from the harsh lessons of survival, from the interplay of hunger, fear, and moral restraint. The forest may be empty, the snow may conceal all evidence of life, yet within these landscapes, and within the human heart that braves them, the Wendigo endures. A patient, haunting reminder that the cold tests more than flesh. It tests the very spirit that binds us together, and the conscience that defines us as human. Even before the first snowdrifts fell, before the long nights settled into the forests, the Wendigo existed in the collective imagination, not only as a monster of flesh, but as a moral compass, a caution whispered from parent to child beside crackling fires. In the frigid expanses of the north, where isolation stretched like a frozen river and hunger gnawed at every hearth, stories became the scaffolding of survival. They were not told merely to frighten, but to instruct, to embed lessons into the marrow of the community, so that the boundaries of human behavior might endure even under extreme duress. These tales were deliberate, measured, and meticulously repeated. They spoke of men and women who succumbed to the gnawing hunger, whose desperation twisted them into figures grotesque and eternal, their forms reflecting the corruption of the spirit within. In the telling, the Wendigo is more than a monster. It is the embodiment of unrestrained desire, a warning of what happens when the human conscience falters under the weight of need. Villagers understood that to ignore these stories was to court disaster. The lessons they carried were practical, ethical, and deeply psychological. The oral tradition preserved not only narrative detail, but also moral architecture. Each story marked boundaries, the consequences of greed, the dangers of selfishness, the imperatives of empathy and restraint. The Wendigo was invoked whenever these boundaries threatened to erode. A hunter returning with more than his fair share of food might be reminded of the specter in the forest. A child who disobeyed communal rules could be told of the endless hunger waiting in the snow. These tales carried authority precisely because they were grounded in shared experience and environmental reality. Hunger and isolation were not abstract concepts. They were immediate, tangible threats, and the stories were the clearest way to convey their ethical weight. Historically, these narratives also served to bind the community together. They ensured that even in times of scarcity, when survival demanded difficult choices, there remained a collective conscience to guide behavior. Individuals internalized the stories, learning to recognize the first stirrings of desire that could become monstrous if left unchecked. In this sense, the Wendigo is as much a social instrument as it is a supernatural entity. It encodes cultural knowledge into narrative form, preserving lessons that might otherwise have been lost to the merciless passage of winter or the attrition of generations. The imagery within these stories is both vivid and symbolic. Gaunt figures, eyes hollow and glimmering, limbs elongated, always in motion yet never sated. They are the echoes of human vulnerability rendered tangible. Each description communicates not only the horror of physical transformation but also the spiritual consequences of unbridled hunger. The tales function as mirrors. They reflect the potential for moral collapse in every listener, offering a space to confront the shadow within before it can manifest in action. In this way, the stories are as much preventative as they are cautionary. Anthropologists have long noted that societies in extreme environments often encode survival knowledge within myth. The Wendigo is exemplary in this regard. It is at once a spiritual figure, a moral arbiter, and a repository of practical wisdom. To fear the Wendigo is to fear the loss of humanity itself. To remember the Wendigo is to honor the ethical limits that allow humans to survive together rather than merely endure as isolated beings. Every retelling reinforces the connection between individual action and communal consequence, between instinct and conscience. Even when the wilderness is silent, even when the snow covers every trace of life, the stories persist. They are carried in memory, in repetition, in the cadence of voices passing from one generation to the next. They remind each listener that horror is not always external, that monsters are often reflections of our own desires, and that restraint, empathy, and community are the truest defenses against both physical and moral starvation. The Wendigo's hunger is never satiated, and the stories that contain it must never be forgotten. And so, the tales endure not merely as folklore, but as moral architecture etched into the collective consciousness. They are warnings, yes, but also acts of preservation. Preservation of life, of conscience, and of community. They are a testament to human ingenuity, the understanding that survival is as much a question of ethics as of sustenance. Each story, each warning, each whispered fear is a thread in a tapestry of communal resilience, woven to endure the long winters and the relentless hunger of the forest. In the end, to listen to these stories is to hear the heartbeat of survival itself. They echo with the lessons of ancestors who understood that hunger is not just physical, that isolation is not only spatial, and that human desire can be both a necessity and a threat. The Wendigo is never far, never absent. It moves silently in the snowdrifts and whispers in the wind. And in the stories we pass down, we honor both the peril and the possibility. The peril of surrender to hunger, and the possibility that humanity, guided by wisdom and fear, can endure even the harshest winters. Even in the frozen wilderness, where the forests stretch unbroken and the rivers are trapped beneath sheets of ice, the Wendigo was not confined to story alone. Those who lived in these remote lands sometimes claimed to see it, to feel its presence, or to sense its insatiable hunger in the shadows of their own thoughts. Encounters were rare, yet they were etched into memory with a clarity and terror that endured across generations. In these moments, the boundary between myth and reality blurred, and the monster that haunted tales seemed to breathe beside the living. Travelers, hunters, and settlers recorded their experiences in diaries, letters, and oral accounts, describing figures that moved too silently, eyes that gleamed unnaturally, and forms that seemed stretched and twisted beyond human proportion. Some spoke of men lost in the snow who returned changed, gaunt and hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of an unspoken hunger. Others witnessed shapes in the trees or the faint sound of footsteps over frozen ground, sensing a presence that was not animal, yet not fully human. These accounts, often dismissed as superstition, reveal a consistent pattern. The Wendigo is as much a psychological phenomenon as a folkloric one, its influence seeping into minds as surely as it prowled the forests. There is a rhythm to these testimonies, a cadence that echoes across centuries. Witnesses describe the same features: elongated limbs, eyes that burn with an unnatural fire, movements that are both swift and unsettlingly deliberate. They recount feelings of dread, a visceral recognition that hunger has taken a life beyond the ordinary, a presence that defies understanding. And yet, these encounters are not always violent. Sometimes they are subtle, almost imperceptible. A shadow at the edge of vision, a whisper in the wind, the feeling of being watched in the endless white. In these instances, the Wendigo is less a predator than a reminder, a reflection of human fear and fragility. Anthropologists examining these testimonies note the convergence of environment, psychology, and cultural memory. The harsh northern winters, the isolation, the scarcity of resources. All these conditions shape perception, heighten fear, and magnify the mind's capacity to project internal anxieties outward. The Wendigo, then, becomes both a literal and symbolic figure, an externalized embodiment of hunger, isolation, and moral strain. Encounters serve as narratives of caution, reinforcing the lessons embedded in folklore and ritual. The forest, in this sense, is both a physical space and a moral landscape, where the human psyche negotiates its own boundaries. Yet, these accounts also carry profound human meaning. They reveal the ways in which belief and experience intertwine, and how myth can shape perception as much as it reflects it. Witnesses' fear is not irrational. It is rooted in lived danger, in the relentless pressure of the environment, and in the moral imperatives of survival. The Wendigo is a mirror held to the self, reflecting both the physical peril of starvation and the ethical peril of surrendering to base instincts. Each encounter reinforces the delicate balance between human desire and conscience, a reminder that survival is as much about restraint as it is about endurance. Some testimonies describe direct confrontation, moments when the spirit or figure of the Wendigo seemed to test the boundaries of courage and morality. Hunters returning from the forests sometimes spoke of shadows that followed them, figures that mirrored their own exhaustion and longing, as if the Wendigo had risen from within to haunt them. Families remembered the disappearance of loved ones under snowstorms or during solitary journeys, recounting their fear that the Wendigo had claimed them, either in body or spirit. Even when physical evidence was absent, the memory of these encounters shaped behavior, dictating caution, community cohesion, and ethical vigilance. The continuity of these testimonies is remarkable. Across time and distance, descriptions remain consistent, suggesting a shared cultural and psychological framework. They reveal not only the fear of the unknown, but a deeper, more profound concern, that the monster is inseparable from the human condition, that the forest, the winter, and the isolation are catalysts for inner transformation. To witness the Wendigo is to confront the potential for moral collapse, the insatiable hunger that can dwell within any human when circumstances erode restraint. Modern interpretations have sought to contextualize these encounters through psychology, anthropology, and ethnography. Cases of Wendigo psychosis illuminate how extreme isolation, starvation, and cultural belief systems can produce hallucination, obsession, and even the compulsion to cannibalism. Yet beyond the clinical lens, these testimonies endure as stories of human endurance and vulnerability. They capture the tension between survival and morality, fear and reason, flesh and spirit. In listening to them, we are drawn into the same forests, the same snowbound silence, and the same moral terrain where ancient communities confronted forces both real and imagined. And so, the encounters recorded in diaries, letters, and oral accounts do more than entertain. They instruct, warn, and preserve memory. They tether the human experience to the ethical architecture embedded in folklore, ensuring that even in the harshest conditions, when hunger gnaws and isolation stretches endlessly, humanity's moral compass remains intact. The Wendigo is ever present in these narratives, a shadow stalking not only the forest, but the mind of the listener, reminding each generation that the most profound monsters are often those that dwell within. In the end, these testimonies are echoes of a world shaped by extremes, a reflection of the enduring tension between human vulnerability and resilience. They remind us that the Wendigo, though a figure of myth, exists wherever hunger, fear, and moral compromise intersect. The stories endure because the lessons they carry are eternal. Survival demands not only strength but conscience. Isolation can awaken monsters within, and the memory of the lost, the observed, and the haunted ensures that the boundaries of humanity are never forgotten. The Wendigo exists at the intersection of myth and mind, where stories of the forest meet the fragile architecture of human consciousness. For centuries, it was whispered about beside fires, traced in the snow by trembling hands, and feared in the endless white of northern winters. Yet, over time, the figure of the Wendigo has been examined not only through the lens of folklore, but through the lens of human psychology, revealing the ways in which myth and psychosis are intertwined, and how a legend can emerge from the deepest recesses of the mind. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, accounts of what became known as Wendigo psychosis were documented by anthropologists and medical observers. Individuals, often isolated or starving, began to exhibit an intense preoccupation with consuming human flesh, paired with a fear of transforming into a cannibal themselves. The symptoms were extreme: obsession, anxiety, hallucination, and an overwhelming sense of internal hunger that could not be satisfied. Here, the myth of the Wendigo became inseparable from human experience, a story externalized, made visible, yet profoundly internal, manifesting within the psyche as a terrifying reality. The cultural context is crucial to understanding this phenomenon. In Algonquian communities, where survival in harsh winters required both skill and restraint, the Wendigo myth functioned as a moral compass. It taught that giving in to extreme hunger or selfish desire could unmake a person, transforming them into something inhuman. Psychologically, this narrative created a framework in which extreme stress, isolation, and starvation could be interpreted, contained, and, in some cases, rationalized. The legend became a lens for understanding not just external threats, but the internal vulnerability of the human mind when pressed beyond its limits. Cases of Wendigo psychosis often reflect the same themes found in the folklore: isolation, hunger, and the breakdown of social and moral norms. Individuals reported feeling as though a monstrous force had taken hold within them, driving them toward acts they could not resist, even as they feared their own impulses. Some fled into the forests, consumed by delusions, while others became obsessed with the idea that they themselves were transforming. These experiences underscore the uncanny relationship between myth and mental disorder. The story shapes the mind, and the mind, in turn, brings the story to life. Anthropologists and psychologists have long debated whether these cases are cultural phenomena, biological responses to extreme deprivation, or a combination of both. What remains clear is that the Wendigo myth serves as a vessel for understanding the pressures of human survival in extreme environments. It externalizes fears, codifies morality, and transforms individual experience into collective memory. The psychosis is a reflection of both the environment and the cultural framework that interprets it, a blending of flesh, spirit, and consciousness that mirrors the duality of the Wendigo itself. The transformation described in these accounts is both terrifying and deeply human. The monster is not entirely separate from the individual. It is an extension of desire, fear, and moral compromise. Hunger becomes spiritual as well as physical, and the line between human and monster blurs. Psychologists today view Wendigo psychosis as a culturally specific syndrome, a rare but potent illustration of how belief and environment can interact to shape mental states. Yet, in the telling, it is also a meditation on the fragile boundary between instinct and morality, showing how extreme circumstances can awaken the most profound and terrifying aspects of human nature. Even as science interprets the phenomenon, the myth endures because it addresses truths that are both timeless and universal. It reminds us that the darkest monsters are often internal, arising from fear, deprivation, and the erosion of ethical restraint. The Wendigo is never merely a spirit of the forest. It is a reflection of what humans might become when necessity eclipses conscience, when isolation stretches endlessly, and when hunger gnaws not only at the body, but at the moral and spiritual self. The enduring power of the Wendigo lies in this duality. It is simultaneously external and internal, literal and metaphorical, flesh and spirit entwined. Its stories warn of the physical dangers of survival in harsh climates, the moral dangers of unbridled desire, and the psychological dangers of extreme isolation. In every retelling, the Wendigo remains a mirror, one that reflects the potential for human cruelty, the fragility of ethical restraint, and the terrifying possibilities that arise when mind and myth converge. In modern culture, the Wendigo continues to haunt literature, film, and folklore studies. Psychologists reference its psychosis, anthropologists analyze its origins, and storytellers preserve its spectral image. But in all these iterations, the central lesson remains. The monster is as much a part of the human mind as it is of the snow-laden forest. It is a reminder that myths are not mere fantasies. They are reflections of human experience, ethical frameworks encoded into narrative, and enduring symbols of the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. In the quiet of the forest, when the snow presses down and the wind carries only silence, the Wendigo waits, not just in the trees, but in the recesses of the mind. It is patient, eternal, and intimately familiar, because it is born from the same impulses, fears, and desires that inhabit every human heart. Myth and psychosis are not opposed. They are entwined, each giving form to the other, revealing a truth that is both haunting and undeniable. The greatest monsters are not those that lurk in the shadows, but those that awaken within ourselves when the world becomes too vast, too cold, or too hungry to ignore. And so, the Wendigo endures, a legend, a warning, a psychosis, and a mirror. It reminds us that survival is never purely physical, that hunger reaches beyond the body, and that the human spirit must navigate both the wilderness without and the wilderness within. The myth lives because it reveals the eternal struggle between flesh and spirit, instinct and conscience, fear and restraint. It is a story of humanity, encased in ice, whispered across generations, and never forgotten. The Wendigo, once whispered about only in the forests of the north, has found a new life far beyond the snow-laden landscapes of Algonquian memory. Its image persists in literature, film, and even psychological discourse, transformed yet unmistakable. In these modern echoes, the Wendigo is no longer only a caution against hunger or moral collapse. It is a symbol of the human condition, a creature that embodies fear, desire, and the darkness that resides within us all. In novels and stories, the Wendigo appears as a figure both terrifying and instructive, its elongated limbs and hollow eyes reflecting not just physical horror but the psychological tension between instinct and conscience. Filmmakers have captured its relentless presence, setting it against landscapes of isolation and winter, where the line between survival and monstrosity is blurred. These modern depictions retain the core of the myth. The Wendigo is never simply an external adversary. It is always intimately tied to the human mind, to the ways in which fear, hunger, and desperation can shape thought, morality, and identity. Even in contemporary psychological studies, the Wendigo's legacy endures. Researchers reference Wendigo psychosis as a culturally specific phenomenon, illustrating the profound ways in which belief and environment shape perception. The syndrome reflects the same tension that the original folklore described. The struggle between hunger and morality, survival and conscience, flesh and spirit. Modern observers may frame it in clinical terms, but the essence remains the same. A reminder that the boundaries between myth and reality, mind and body, are often fragile, especially under extreme stress. The figure of the Wendigo has also become a lens through which broader cultural anxieties are explored. In literature and film, it serves as a metaphor for greed, insatiable consumption, and the corrosion of ethics in the pursuit of desire. Corporations, environmental destruction, and human excess are sometimes cast in the shadow of the Wendigo, a haunting specter that reminds audiences that monstrous hunger is not confined to the wilderness. It can dwell in the human heart and in the systems we create. In this way, the legend continues to teach, to warn, and to provoke reflection on the moral architecture of our own societies. Modern storytellers preserve the same duality that the Algonquian peoples recognized centuries ago. The Wendigo exists outside us, in the forest or in the narrative, but it also exists within, in the recesses of fear, desire, and ethical compromise. Its presence in popular culture is therefore not mere entertainment. It is a continuation of the original purpose of the myth. It reminds us that, no matter how far we travel from the frozen forests of the north, the moral lessons embedded in these stories remain vital. Hunger, isolation, and desire have not vanished. They persist in the human condition, and with them, the potential for both transformation and destruction. Anthropologists, psychologists, and storytellers alike note that the endurance of the Wendigo speaks to the universality of its message. It is a mirror reflecting human weakness and strength, a cautionary figure illustrating that the darkest impulses often arise not from external monsters, but from within. The Wendigo in modern culture may take new forms, but its essence, a warning of the consequences of unrestrained hunger, both literal and metaphorical, remains unaltered. It is a story that transcends time and place, connecting ancient survival lessons with contemporary ethical reflection. Even today, when snow no longer binds the majority of the human population and isolation is often psychological rather than geographic, the Wendigo resonates. Its elongated limbs and hollow eyes, whether on a silver screen or in the pages of a novel, serve as reminders that hunger can take many forms. The hunger of the body, the hunger of desire, and the hunger of the conscience. These modern interpretations underscore the enduring relevance of the myth. They show that the Wendigo is not confined to folklore. It is a reflection of human vulnerability, a symbol of the tension between restraint and indulgence, survival and morality, flesh and spirit. And so, the Wendigo endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a living testament to the power of myth to adapt, survive, and instruct. It exists wherever stories are told, wherever fear and reflection intersect, and wherever humans confront the darker corners of their own hearts. In the forests of imagination, in the corridors of consciousness, and on the stages of culture, the Wendigo whispers across time, a warning that the lessons of the North are never irrelevant, and that the hunger it embodies, whether for sustenance, power, or desire, remains a force that must be acknowledged, respected, and restrained. In the end, the Wendigo is more than a story. It is a mirror, a warning, and a shadow that follows humanity through centuries, continents, and imaginations. Its echoes in modern culture are proof that myth is never static, that fear is never confined, and that the lessons of survival, morality, and restraint endure in every age. The monster of the North has crossed from forest to page, from ice to screen, and still at its core, it reflects us. Our hunger, our fear, and the fragile light of conscience that resists the shadow. The Wendigo story does not end with the last tale told beside the fire, nor with the final snow of a long winter. Its legacy stretches beyond the forests of the North, beyond the pages of folklore, beyond even the boundaries of psychological study. It endures because it embodies something eternal, the tension between survival and morality, the shadow of desire that can consume the human heart, and the fragile light of conscience that resists the pull of hunger. In every era, the Wendigo reminds us that monsters are not merely born of the wilderness. They are born of circumstance, choice, and the impulses that dwell within. Throughout centuries, communities have passed down stories that tether the living to lessons of restraint and ethical vigilance. The Wendigo functions as a mirror, reflecting the fears, vulnerabilities, and moral anxieties of humanity. Hunger, isolation, and desperation may drive the body, but it is the erosion of empathy and the surrender of the spirit that make one truly monstrous. This is the core of its legacy, the understanding that monstrosity is never entirely external. It is cultivated within the human heart when restraint falters and desire is left unchecked. Even today, the lessons embedded in these ancient tales resonate. In extreme conditions, in times of scarcity, in moments when survival threatens to eclipse conscience, the Wendigo lingers, not as a specter of the past, but as a caution for the present. Psychologists, anthropologists, and storytellers continue to study and retell its myth, recognizing its value as both a reflection of human psychology and a repository of cultural wisdom. The monster persists as a symbol of what might happen when necessity and morality collide, and when hunger in all its forms is allowed to dominate. The legacy of the Wendigo is also a testament to the resilience of culture. For centuries, Algonquian communities and neighboring peoples embedded moral frameworks into their stories, encoding social norms, survival strategies, and ethical imperatives into tales of terror. The Wendigo is the embodiment of those imperatives, an eternal reminder of the consequences of surrendering to greed, hunger, and isolation. Its form, a gaunt figure, eyes burning with insatiable desire, limbs stretched as though to contain an endless appetite, remains as symbolic today as it was centuries ago, a visual language of warning and reflection. What endures most, however, is the human truth at the heart of the legend. The Wendigo is never solely about monsters. It is about us. It is about the hunger we carry, the choices we make, and the morality we preserve under pressure. It is about the moments when our instincts clash with our conscience, when survival demands sacrifice, and when the wilderness, literal or psychological, tests the boundaries of our humanity. To understand the Wendigo is to understand the precariousness of these boundaries, and the fragility and resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming need. Its echoes in modern culture reinforce this lesson. Literature, film, and psychology all revisit the Wendigo, exploring themes of insatiable desire, moral erosion, and human vulnerability. These retellings confirm that the myth is not merely entertainment. It is a vessel carrying the wisdom and caution of generations. Even as the landscapes of the North fade from memory, even as snow no longer isolates most communities for months at a time, the Wendigo's warning persists. The shadow of hunger, when untempered by conscience, can claim any human heart. And yet, in its enduring presence, there is also hope. The Wendigo reminds us that survival is not simply a matter of endurance. It is a matter of moral vigilance. By remembering its lessons, by telling its stories, by respecting the boundaries between desire and restraint, humans can navigate even the harshest trials without surrendering to the monstrous impulses within. The legend teaches that monsters are not inevitable, that awareness, ethics, and community are the shields that preserve humanity. In the final reckoning, the Wendigo is both a shadow and a guide. It walks the snowbound forests, haunts the corridors of the mind, and whispers through the pages of history. It embodies hunger, fear, and the potential for moral collapse, but also the necessity of restraint, reflection, and compassion. Its legacy endures because it is timeless, because it addresses universal truths about the human condition, and because it serves as a perpetual reminder. To survive is not enough, and to live without conscience is to invite the monster within. And so, as the wind sweeps across frozen lakes, as shadows stretch beneath skeletal trees, and as silence falls over snowbound landscapes, the Wendigo waits, not merely as a figure of myth, but as a lesson etched into the human heart. It reminds us that hunger in all its forms can shape flesh, spirit, and society, and that the preservation of conscience is the most vital act of survival. Its story, carried across generations, across cultures, across centuries, endures as a haunting testament to the fragile, beautiful, and terrifying depths of the human soul.